Now, the United Nations Climate Ambition Summit, as we said, kicks off in New York this week on the sidelines of the General Assembly. The summit will be focusing on moving towards the decarbonization of economies and boosting early warning system. Steve Nicholls is the head of Energy and Mitigation Unit at the Presidential Climate Commission. Steve, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So this summit will be focusing a lot on accelerating the decarbonization of economies, and we have been having mixed messages in our government around decarbonization. Are we participating at the summit with a clear position as South Africa?
Yeah, I believe we are. I think some context is very important here. The summit is happening in the context that the science has recently been updated and confirms that we need to stay below 1.5 degrees. And that requires immediate and deep cuts across the global economy, including South Africa. And so this is why the UN have gathered global leaders as well as business, civil society, and other social partners to work on accelerating action. And I think in the South Africa's case, we have a strong ambition embedded in our nationally determined contribution. The president, as recently as the BRICS summit here in Johannesburg, emphasized that this is something we need both locally and globally.
Yeah, and I suppose the reason I'm saying mixed messages is because you hear of the commitment that the president often reaffirms and reassures, and then you hear other ministers, like the Minister of Energy, Gwede Mantashe, who has been, in fact, urging even our government to be quite cautious in its commitment and approach to decarbonization. Hence, I'm mentioning the mixed messages. But how does our government ensure its commitment to this decarbonization and ensure that it's not undermined and that there's no compromise on the money that's been committed by the European Union and other institutions? Because government seems to say we need both fossil fuel and renewables. Hence, some ministers pushing for government to rethink its decision to decommission some power stations.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep timelines in mind here. So we're thinking about decarbonizing between now and 2050. And so when we talk about the transition, there are things that we will continue to do, and there are things that we phase out of the economy, and there are things that we need to reintroduce. And there's a lot of debates locally, inside and outside of government, about the pace at which this needs to happen. And I think what's important for us as South African society is to not ignore the evidence. And the evidence shows that extreme climate change would have very negative impacts on South Africa, but that there's a huge opportunity for industrialization. And maybe just one quick statistic, the work that the National Business Initiative did, looking at the risk that our economy faces to exports, shows that the heavy manufacturing sector in South Africa risks losing 50%, or about 170 billion rand of its exports, to changes in EU legislation, and that's linked to about 350,000 jobs. On the flip side, however, enhanced demand from a green industrialization strategy in South Africa would lead to things like 270% increases in steel demand, 70% in cement demand, 240% in aluminium demand, and could create 740,000 jobs. So the important thing for us here is to focus on this idea of green industrialization, and we see a lot of alignment within government ministers on that.
Okay. There's this 130 billion rand investment by international donors, that has to be factored into, right, the cabinet-approved Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that envisages this investment program of 1.5 trillion rand over the next 5 years. And I'm just wondering here whether there is enough social security support for the affected communities. And I'm asking that, Stephen, because what we have seen in Komati, for instance, in the Mpumalanga belt, is that some people who used to work for that power station that has now since been decommissioned are now protesting and saying, we are struggling to be connected to opportunities as was previously promised. So do we just get excited about the monies that we get to decarbonize, or do we actually have a social security plan that will insulate the workers in these mines that we are trying to decommission?
Look, I think it would be fair to say that our plan is not yet perfect, but certainly we're working on it. And there's a huge commitment amongst all of the stakeholders within the presidency, within the project management unit that is working on the investment plan and the implementation of that investment plan to social protection. It is also one of the core pillars of South Africa's Just Transition Framework, which was approved by Cabinet last year after consultation that we did at the Presidential Climate Commission. So I think the commitment is clear, but of course in South Africa the big challenge is implementation. And it's worth noting that part of this implementation plan of the loan that you mentioned, it does include a big grant portion, and that is focused on social protection, economic diversification. So we desperately need to create jobs in these high impact areas like in Mpumalanga, but also on supporting local government. And so part of what we need to be able to do is build the capacity of government and of society in South Africa to absorb further support. So we envisage this as just being the first round of support, but then also, of course, leverages domestic capital to enhance investment. And second and third rounds even would then enhance our ability on social protection.
Nicholls, the head of Energy and Mitigation Unit at the Presidential Climate Commission, thank you for making time.